My actual reaction to today's top story when I first learned about it was, oh my God, that might actually be the worst thing that can happen to you. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please kidnap the like button, cover them in barbecue sauce, and then drop them off on the beaches of Niku Island. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of February 28, 2013, 37-year-old Jeff Bush was just getting home from his job as a laborer. He walked through the front door of his very modest single-story home in Seffner, Florida, which is just outside of Tampa, and he walked into the kitchen where his sister-in-law and his niece were, and he said hi to them, and he checked in on them. They both lived with Jeff, as did Jeff's brother, Jeremy. After a few minutes of small talk with them, he left the kitchen and went to his own bedroom, the same bedroom he had been sleeping in since he was a little kid. He had grown up in this house. He goes into his room and he hops on the bed, turns on the TV, and looks forward to relaxing for the next couple of hours before going to sleep. A couple of hours later, Jeremy comes home from his second job. He actually worked during the day with Jeff at the same company, but had to pick up additional shifts at night because he needed to support his daughter and his wife. And so he comes home and he goes through the front door and he goes over to Jeff's room and he knocks on the door and he opens it up and he says, "Hey Jeff, we don't have work tomorrow. I just found out, so feel free to sleep in tomorrow." Jeff was pretty happy about this and he said, "Okay, thanks for letting me know." And then Jeremy shut Jeff's door, turned around and walked out to see his wife and his kid. About an hour later at 11 p.m., Jeremy, his wife, and his kid are on the other side of the house from where Jeffrey is, and they're laying in bed watching TV when all of a sudden they hear what sounds like a car smashing into the side of the house. It's extremely loud, and immediately Jeremy jumps out of his bed and he hears from the other side of the house Jeff yelling out for help. Jeremy runs into the hall, his wife's right behind him, and there's no damage in the hall, there's no smoke, there's no fire, and they see Jeff's bedroom is still shut, so they run down the hall, they open that door up, and it's dark in his room, and as Jeremy's trying to figure out what he's looking at, his wife reaches behind him and flicks on the switch, and the light from the room illuminates the most bizarre and horrible scene. Jeff, the bedroom, everything, it's all gone, and it's been replaced by this massive sinkhole right in the middle of the room. As Jeff was laying on his bed, apparently the sinkhole had opened up, and when it did, it completely opened up. Jeff fell into it along with everything else in the room, and then it kind of churned on top of him, like it opened its mouth and then squeezed up over him, so that when Jeremy is looking in, it actually looked like a flat layer of dirt. He could only see the corner of a bed poking out. There was no sign of Jeff. He saw the cable from the TV was still coming off the wall and going into the pit and disappearing into the dirt. And so Jeremy starts screaming for Jeff, and he can hear Jeff's muffled screams as he's yelling for him to come save him. And so Jeremy, without any hesitation, jumps into this hole, which right then, it was only about 6 to 10 feet deep. It would end up becoming 60 feet deep over the next couple of days. But initially, it was only about 6 feet deep. He jumps in and he starts using his hands to try to burrow down to his brother. But for every scoop he was able to remove, about 10 times that would be created as the walls continued to collapse and this hole continued to sink and grow. Jeremy's wife calls the police, and Jeremy gets a shovel and he goes back into the hole and he's digging as fast as he can, but he's really making no progress, and he's screaming for his brother, but eventually Jeff yells for help, stop, and he can't hear him, he can't see him, and he's just digging, but he knows he's gone. When the police arrived, they forcibly removed Jeremy from the hole. He did not want to leave his brother. They pulled him out of the house, they pulled his wife and his kid out, and they've evacuated the area. And they had to rope it off because they didn't want anybody going near it, because they didn't know how big this hole was going to get. They weren't sure if it was going to suddenly open up and engulf, the whole stretch of the street. And so all of Jeff's family just had to watch in horror as they basically did nothing to try to help him. They had to let the sinkhole basically develop before they were able to actually go in there and try to help him. And so if he had been alive, there was just no way they could have saved him. After several hours, they were able to go up close and feed in this microphone system that they put on top of the actual sinkhole that would apparently be able to pick up sound if Jeff was making any sound whatsoever. and it wasn't picking up any signs of life, and at this point they determined that he was deceased. But before they could get their audio recorder out of the hole opened up again, got even bigger, and swallowed the recorder into the hole. But despite getting bigger and wider and actually getting big tools in there to start trying to pull stuff out of it, they could never find Jeff's body. And so the decision was made to leave him wherever he is, somewhere in the sinkhole, and they filled it in with gravel, and then they knocked down the house as well as the 2 other neighboring houses. And so to this day, Jeffrey's body is still somewhere underground in that sinkhole. In 2008, Joshua Maddox was an 18-year-old guy living in a small city in Colorado. He was known for having a very carefree attitude. He was kind of a free spirit. He had really long hair, he liked to play the guitar, he loved music, and he spent a lot of his time free writing. His parents were divorced, so Josh lived with his father, whose name was Mike, and his 2 sisters, who were named Kate and Ruth. On May 8th, he told his sister Kate that he was going for a walk as he left the house. Josh loved being out in nature and regularly went out walking around the woods by himself, so this was not out of the ordinary for him. But that night, when he didn't come back, that was out of the ordinary, and the family was pretty concerned. By the next day, when he hadn't shown up and they couldn't get in touch with him, and they called around and no one knew where he was, they would go to the police and file a missing person report. So the police launched this massive search, but there's nothing really to go on besides what he told Kate before he left, which was, "I'm going for a walk." So there wasn't really a good starting point, and so they weren't getting anywhere. As days turned into weeks, turned into months, and no one's heard from him, no one knows what happened to him, hope was fading that they were going to find him alive. In fact, hope was fading that they were even going to find his body. 7 years after Josh went missing, a startling discovery was made. A builder named Chuck Murphy had this little tiny cabin he owned in the middle of the woods, about a mile away from where Josh's family home was in Colorado. The cabin had fallen into disrepair. At one time he might have used it, but now the land it was on was much more valuable than the cabin itself. So the decision was made to demolish the cabin and sell the land. And so he brings out a demolition crew, they start knocking down walls, and when they crack open the chimney, when they're standing inside of the cabin and the chimney is now coming down, they see a body crammed into the chimney in the fetal position with its legs over its head. Chuck calls the police, who come over, and they're able to identify this body as being that of Josh Maddox. The cabin had been consistently overlooked during the different searches for Josh because it just didn't look like a place anybody would go. It was like this broken down, caving in pile of wood, and they just kind of wrote it off. No one thought to actually go check it out. Chuck, the owner of the cabin, said that he was really never there, but he had gone in the time between when Josh disappeared and now, and he said when he went inside there was no signs of anything unusual. It looked like the same old cabin, and he was only in there for a couple of minutes, but he didn't see anything. The autopsy revealed Josh had been wedged inside of this chimney for 7 years, meaning as soon as he went missing, he wound up wedged in the chimney less than a mile from his house. He had no drugs in his system, he had no trauma to his body, so no broken bones or knife marks or gunshot wounds. Initially, authorities said this death was an accident, and what must have happened is Josh came to this cabin and he wanted to get inside. It was locked, and so he thought he would go through the chimney and he got stuck. But Chuck Murphy said, no, that's not possible, because I put this really heavy-duty rebar cage over the top of the chimney cap to prevent animals and other debris getting inside the chimney. And certainly a person could not have fit through there. However, they couldn't go back and confirm there was indeed this chimney cap because the cabin had already been demolished. In addition to the chimney cap that kind of contradicted this whole accident hypothesis, there were a few other significant unanswered questions about this case. The first one was there was this big breakfast bar, this wooden breakfast bar that was ripped off the wall inside of the cabin and placed up against the fireplace. And if that wasn't there, you would be able to see the underside of Josh because he was tucked up just underneath where you could see. So that means either Josh ripped it off the wall and put it in front of the chimney before going into the chimney, or he was in the chimney and somebody else broke it off and put it in front. The second big question mark is Josh's body position. His legs were over his head, so his position indicates he would have had to go into the chimney head first. And so, I don't know about you, but if you were going to go into a chimney, I would not be leaping head first. It just seems counterintuitive and unnecessarily risky. And the third question mark are Josh's clothes, or lack thereof. He was only wearing a shirt. He didn't have pants or underwear or anything else on, just a thermal shirt. And the clothes he didn't have on were neatly folded and stacked inside the cabin next to the fireplace. Meaning, for this to be an accident, he would have had to gain access to the cabin, take off most of his clothing, fold it up, put it next to the fireplace, rip off the breakfast bar, put it in front of the fireplace, go outside, climb onto the roof, rip off the rebar cage, and then only wearing a t-shirt, go head first down a chimney, and then get stuck and die. Very few people, including authorities, buy this is truly just an accident, but they're lacking evidence to suggest it's something else. And so to this day, it remains an accident. On December 6, 1941, 20-year-old U.S. Navy sailor Clifford Olds met up with a couple of his shipmates at the Monkey Bar for a night out in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A barmaid took this picture of Cliff all the way on the right with his friends and then offered to sell this back to them, to which they said, "That's a ripoff, you can keep it." This would be the last picture of Cliff alive. The next morning, just before 8 a.m., Cliff was back on board his ship, the USS West Virginia. He was starting his workday when the Japanese launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Cliff's ship was a prime target and was quickly hit with 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes, hundreds of people are dying on board, and very quickly his ship is starting to sink. On board a Navy ship, there's all these different conditions the ship is set to depending on what you're doing, whether you're at war or you're just docked in peacetime, and all of these different conditions have very specific instructions. And one of those conditions is condition Z. Better known as setting Z, if the captain of a ship calls this out over the loudspeakers, every single hatch inside of that ship is shut and locked. If your ship is sinking and you say set Z, you are sealing all of those compartments so no more water can flow into them, and you can maintain a little bit of buoyancy so you don't sink quite as fast. But if you set Z as your ship is sinking, especially if you're getting attacked and there's all these holes in your ship, there's a good chance when you seal those hatches, you're going to be sealing people inside of these rooms and they will not be able to get out again. So when that call comes out over the loudspeakers, set Z, everybody knows to get the heck out of their compartments so that they do not get trapped inside of one of those rooms. On Cliff's ship, set Z was called over the loudspeakers, and Cliff, along with Ron Endicott, who was 18, and Buddy Costin, who was 21, were at the bottom of the ship in the freshwater pump room, and when someone came by and shut and sealed their room, they did not see them in there. And so probably the 3 of them ran to the door and were banging on it and trying to get someone's attention. But in the chaos of the moment, that person on the other side of the door that could have opened it up again was now gone. Even though the set Z procedure did prevent water from going into certain cabins on the West Virginia, it still would sink to the bottom of the ocean along with 17 other ships. The next day, there was a whole bunch of Marines that were on the dock right next to where the wreckage of the West Virginia was underneath the water. And as they're standing on the dock, they start hearing a banging sound. And at first they think it's probably just a salvage team or it's some strap clanging against the side of one of these ships. But they started to notice the tapping sounds started to sound like intentional rhythms that a human might make. And it dawned on them that someone is trying to get our attention underwater. There are people trapped in the West Virginia. But when the Marines ran to their superiors and told them there are people trapped inside of the ship, we have to get them out, they broke the horrible news that there's nothing they could do for them. If they went down and began trying to cut a hole in the side of the ship so they could swim out, as soon as there's even a tiny little hole on the side of that ship, there's so much pressure that it would rush inside and fill that space almost immediately, and they wouldn't be able to cut a hole big enough fast enough, and so cutting into the ship is going to kill them. Also, just lighting that torch presents a unique problem because there's so many chemicals in the water from all of the attacks that happened the day before. We run the risk of lighting a fire or lighting off an explosion that could take even more life. And because they were still months away from being able to raise the ship out of the water, which would save them, the decision was made that we're going to have to let them die. And so for the next 16 days, Marines and sailors were put on guard duty right next to the wreckage of the USS West Virginia, and they would listen to the tapping as they desperately tried to tell people, come down here, save us, we're alive, we're not going anywhere, please help us. And the Marines and sailors were so distressed about this. It was so horrible to listen to. They would cry and cover their ears because they wanted to save them. They're so close, but they're so far away. Finally, on Christmas Eve, the banging stopped. 6 months later, they were finally able to raise the West Virginia out of the water. And as crews were going through all the different compartments and removing bodies, they got to the freshwater pump room where Cliff, Ron, and Buddy had been. They open it up and they find 3 bodies, and they realize right away the torture these poor guys had gone through. Inside this airtight section was this locker full of food rations. They're also in the freshwater pump room, and so they just opened up the tank and they had all the fresh water they needed. But what they didn't have enough of was air. And so for 16 days, sitting in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, knowing they're not going to get out of here, they slowly suffocated. And we know they were alive for those 16 days because they had a calendar where they were marking off each of the days they were down there in red pen. This story was so distressing, the Navy decided not to share the information about what happened to those 3 to their families. It wasn't until years later the truth came out, but even today, on memorials and monuments commemorating what happened at Pearl Harbor, they are listed, Cliff, Buddy, and Ron are listed as killed in action on December 7th. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please kidnap the like button, cover them in barbecue sauce, and then drop them off on Niku Mororo Island. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.